Ko mako e maku I loko o kalani. Aha lopian aku e. Give him money. E ho mai.
We're going to start off with an Eho Imai to call in all our ancestors from the very distant past, because that's where we're all one big family.
Particularly Brother Bob, who's everybody's ancestor at this point.
Yes.
And as Bob used to say, your ancestor, isn't that your mother?
Eho Imai kahiki mai luna mai. O na mea huna no iau. E iau e. Eho Imai. Eho Imai. Eho Imai. Eho Imai kahiki mai luna mai. O na mea huna no iau. O laui Eho Imai. Eho Imai. Eho Imai. Eho Imai kahiki mai luna mai. O na mea huna no iau. O na poe. Eho Imai. Eho Imai. Eho Imai.
Akaka ua manao. Akaka manao io.
One clap is all I get. Victory Gardens. It's once for breakfast.
Exactly.
Climate change is not going to come to us wrapped and labeled as climate. It's going to come to us in weather extremes and in disasters. And the more communities can prepare for dealing with such weather extremes, build their resilience, the easier it will be for those communities to face whatever climate change ultimately is seen as throwing at them. Flight doesn't make it. There's a lot of time in all of these things spent around campfires of various sorts, drinking lots of coffee and talking about how the world works. So there was that kind of exchange, and in many cases it was able to highlight things that the Western scientists weren't even thinking about, and it inspired them to start looking and collecting data in those areas. But that story rarely makes it into the scientific record. I come to this whole climate change, dealing with fossil fuels and mitigation and trying to deal with those issues personally. I mean, I take this really personal. And I know that it's had health effects. For some of you who don't know, I've had 2 heart attacks in doing this work, and I've attributed to PTSD, pre-traumatic stress syndrome. Things have happened because of the interaction of folks here, but we don't get to hear about it, and we'd love to. So if folks can send us letters or information or updates on things that have occurred through here, that would be a great help, I think, for us in showing this institution that they're doing a very good job bringing Native peoples and Indigenous peoples together. We're capable of changing the chemistry of the air. We're doing that now, and that's changing the chemistry of the sea, the acidification of the oceans. Most people have no idea that that's what's going on, or that that's what we're even capable of. So I think building human capacity, we have to become very clear and honest and transparent about the powers of our capacity as we hold them today and use them far more responsibly.
Thank you, Kalani and Hank, for bringing us together, for recognizing Bob. And I hope everyone who's joined us today also feels connected through the tribute video that also brings Bob's words to us and literally brings us all together into whatever space we're in. For this virtual convening. Welcome everybody to the 2nd annual Bob Gough Public Symposium. When we're able to all be together, we have the vision of pairing this public symposium together with the Rising Voices workshops. So this event wraps up our virtual Rising Voices 8 workshop. As you know, the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences is devoted to more durable approaches to our collective future through partnerships between different ways of knowing. Our approach honors and respects knowledge. That really originates and resides outside of the usual canon of earth sciences, and that can help expand what we know about weather and climate, but also especially how we deal with the weather and climate crises that are happening at the intersections of society, weather, and climate. Bob Gough was, some of you know this story, Bob Gough was a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. When I'm Heather Lazarus, I realized I forgot to say my name, but I think you all know. When I started here at NCAR in Boulder about 11 years ago. And he told me that he wanted to write a book about the last 2 decades at that time or so of talking about bringing Indigenous and earth sciences together. I suggested maybe we start with a workshop as a first step. And that was the beginning of the series of Rising Voices workshops. And this year, obviously, we just held our 8th annual workshop. So thank you all for continuing to be part of this conversation. Let's see, I'm not sure if y'all were able to see me, but I'm not sure if that was at my end. In any case, as with the previous 2 years, we missed Bob terribly, and we wanted to take the public events that he used to organize that usually occurred in the evening of one of the days that we were together for the workshop and turn that into the Bob Gough Public Symposium formally. So this is the second annual time that we've been able to do that. Last year, when we were meeting in person, we were able to get together in the Mesa Lab of the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. And that building was designed by I.M. Pei in the 60s to reflect Indigenous architecture, his interpretation, I.M. Pei's interpretation of Indigenous architecture in the Southwest, kind of as a counterpoint to modern Western architecture. And so it was really fitting that we were able to have the first Bob Gough Public Symposium there. In fact, many of you may be aware, but may not, that I.M. Pei also walked on from his home in New York that night, just a few hours after that symposium. So, I also, before we get started with our panel discussion today, I want to acknowledge that one of the greatest gifts Bob brought with bringing us all together was connecting us with his daughter, Lisa, and her children, Vesta and Cactus. And so we're really deeply grateful to have Lisa joining us today, and I think with Cactus as well, while Vesta sleeps off a final from Haskell University. And there's no one better to share their thoughts with us than Lisa and Cactus. So I'll hand this over to you, Lisa.
Okay, I'm still figuring out technology. Aloha, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can share my screen successfully. Just like in good Bob fashion, I worked on this up until about 5 minutes ago, and it's ready to go. Every time I traveled with him, he was always like, go make my copies, go do this, go do that, and sent me all over the place, and he was sitting there finishing it, and then he always just walked in like Mr. Cool Guy and had everything done. Okay, so again, thank you guys for inviting me. Bob came into my life, when I was about 10 or 11 years old, and was totally, when people would ask me, because everyone asks you that, who's the smartest guy you know? And I'd always say, my dad, of course. Well, and my retirement plan truly was to get Bob on the game show Jeopardy. I'd say it to him all the time. All we got to do is get you on, Bob. Got to win that pot of money, then you and I can sit on our land and we could just sit there and I'll help you archive those 2 buses parked outside of Mom's house, and which I'm still taking volunteers for that, by the way. Bob, had other plans and he knew it, and he left enough of us workers around to do all of the work. And what's the work? Well, save the earth, of course. And of course, we're all going to continue to work in grand memory of Grandpa Bob. So I'm just going to show some pictures just from the family side. And I think just in thanking Rising Voices also for the support over the last 2 years to me and the family. Bob was born in 1950 out in New Jersey. And he actually had one sister. He's survived by him. He also has a first cousin that's like his sister also, Barb. He's a father, grandfather, brother, cousin, Ohana, Tioshbae, friend, confidant, attorney, solutionist, visionary, loved by many, and he left a legacy for all that knew him and his story. Pilamae Rising Voices for honoring Bob and for helping with his funeral and for all of the prayers. Bob sent me the photo here on the right of him and his friends on September 10th. It was 1 week before he passed away. And it was kind of crazy because we literally talked for over an hour and a half. And he told me that he had just got done working on this KXL document for the Supreme Court. And Phyllis Towsey in this picture, he graduated law school with her. And oftentimes, would go back to River Falls, Wisconsin and stay with her. In fact, when he took us out to go to law school, we stayed with Phyllis and Scott in a very luxurious house with an outdoor pool. It was just amazing. Bob really, took some Indian kids from the res and showed us that life wasn't just trailer houses, excuse me. But the funniest thing is that Bob, and I think I told many of you this before, but I'll share it again because it's hilarious. But when Bob and I, his dad, were sleeping at his law school graduation, because it was like literally hours long, Bob's dad, gets up and congratulates him when he comes up to the bleachers. And I'm standing there, thinking this is pretty awesome. And Bob's dad says, "Congratulations, Bob, but this is the last graduation I'm attending." But Bob never stopped learning. And I like to think that I got that from him. And the other pictures, like in the middle, is about the age I was, not far away from when Bob came into our family. And then Bob finished a buffalo house on the St. Aglushka University campus. I showed up there one day, and this is him holding all the red tape, which is funny. But he was working on that house all by himself. He had just had his first massive heart attack. And I went over there. I was actually on campus, like doing something with the buffalo. And I noticed him over at the buffalo house, and we even threw some buffalo dung on them walls, And he was in there finishing it by himself. The crew had headed out, and the students were done with their class. And him and I finished that house up, just him and me. It's a pretty cool memory. And of course, this is him and me probably at a Rising Voices out here in Hawaii, which is actually what brought us all out here, right? So, I just want to pay tribute. Another feller I can just not thank enough, on top of all of our Olahana family out here, is Bill. Several of our Rising Voices friends in Ohana for being there for our family when he passed away suddenly, down to like helping with plane tickets. And that's really an example of what Rising Voices is, a family. Here's Bob with June when she was little, Kanan and Mariah's daughter. And Cactus, he had caught a eel, right, at Lapahoihoi. And Bob made like this huge to-do. And they had a ceremony for him. It was just really cool. So we all have stories, I think, that can never be broken. And Bob didn't just fight for what was environmentally right. He fought for his family. He kept custody of all of our kids and the land that they lived on. And he never said no. If someone asked Bob for help, he never said no. He might have said, "Hey, let me see what I can do." But he never told you no. But, sorry guys. Please know that Bob is still looking out for all of us, and he just needs to be everywhere, not just on your couch. So COVID would not have grounded him at all. He would have still been traveling everywhere, right? He just loved everybody. He really did. And, he leaves behind a pretty big family. So in the end here, I'm just going to show some pictures and leave them up for a few seconds. I'm sorry for getting emotional. I just miss calling this guy every day. So here's Bob with some good friends out in South Dakota. This is probably around the time that we all met Bob and started going to ceremony with him and so forth. This is Pat Spears, his great friend here on the bottom that passed away. And of course, we know who all these gentlemen are right here, right? Bob and Kalani's mom, and Jacob, and we all know everyone comes from Rising Voices. The last good 7 or 8 years of our life has really been wrapped around this community of people, and it has just continued to grow. I had such an amazing privilege to be his daughter. Just an amazing privilege to have that access. And I think I told some of you this before, but he was like at the Geneva Peace Conference one time, and I called him and he picks up the phone and he's like, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm kind of busy right now. I'm in the Geneva Peace Conference. And I said, Bob, get off the phone. Like, I'm okay. I'll call you later. And so, that just really, those moments always proved to me how much dearly everybody meant to him. There was there were certain people in his life he'd do anything for, and I just am immensely privileged to be in that circle. And so we got a few more pictures. I like this one too. He looks like Einstein. I used to tease him all the time. Bob, you look like Einstein's cousin, amongst like Santa Claus and, you know, depending on what he was wearing. There's some amazing pictures. Mostly pulled off of Facebook, so thank you all for the photo credits. I probably should have put them on there, but like I said, I did this 10 minutes before we went on. And this one always meant a lot to me here. Sorry, Bob and Pat Spears. You know, they were brothers, and Pat was always at the house. And, you know, Bob could have just given up and quit when Pat passed away, but he didn't. You know, it's like it just gave him more fuel, you know, and he took it pretty hard, you know, about as hard as when he lost his dog Zoe, you know. But he was like a jokester, wasn't he? Like he always was doing something to make us laugh, like no matter what. He was just like, and his dry humor. All the time I'm telling like my kids jokes and they bust out laughing. And then like 5 minutes after I tell a joke and they'll say, Mom, that was like a Bob joke. You know, a water protector, a builder. But if you notice, like I was going through all of his pictures, you know, other than when he was getting the reward, he was doing work. He was literally always the man with the shovel in his hand. He was the guy with a roller with the paint. You know what I'm saying? He was just like always doing the work. And this was him outside of the Buffalo house when it was already almost done, right here in the middle. That's, you know, that was one of his pride and joy things because he built that with his own hands. And it was also something we did together. It was pretty cool. And of course, his love for Julie and Kalani. I mean, just totally, you know, their couch was one of his favorites. So in the end here, all we can do is continue to do the work because Bob told me it's not going to do itself. And I'm going to leave with one quote that Bob used to remind me of. It's a quote by Black Elk, speaking of Crazy Horse. And this is what I put on his, just on a space, you know, I'm going to make a bench, a granite bench or something at some point where he's at. But he's in the pasture where no one can, you know, bother him. But a cow might. So I didn't really want to plant a tree or anything. So I put this stone down and it says, but it does not matter where his body lies, but where his spirit is. Oh, that would be a great place to be. So I like to think of that because Bob really loved that quote. And Vesta, she just graduated early last year. And I wish she could have been here, but she's sleeping off her finals. And Cactus is delivering me some right on time, some bagels and coffee. And here's another kid in the middle real quick that Bob always fought for. You know, we've had several foster kids in and out of our lives. And it's like anytime I would call Bob up and I'd say, Bob, you know, one of the kids' friends has like been on our couch for like 8 weeks. And like legally the kid needs to go to the dentist, you know, or something like that. But the guy would be like, all right, you know, and he would just handle it. And then, of course, I love this one. This was all of us out, you know, having a beer at the pub with everyone and Vesta graduation and then us out in Hawaii with just doing a little activism. So, thank you guys for this time. I can't thank all of you enough, really. We're paying tribute to Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I think it's us thanking you. That was beautiful. The photos are so good to see. And all those memories, ones that some of us share, other ones that are new for all of us. Thank you. And with that, we want to, we're so honored and pleased to hand things over to Dan Wildcat at Haskell Indian Nations University and Bob's longtime friend and co-conspirator to introduce and facilitate our panel today. Just a really quick note, and Dan, feel free to revise anything that I say here. But if folks are happy to sit with their mute buttons on for the panel itself, and then we'll have hopefully time for some Q&A engagement afterwards. But also feel free to use the chat function to interact and engage among yourselves while we're also listening to the panel. So with that, Dan, thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. And Lisa, thank you for sharing those slides. You did true honor and tribute to Bob. He was the master of PowerPoints. And Bob, I loved him to death, but he would always get me worried when he'd say, Dan, I've got a PowerPoint to share. I'd go like, I saw his PowerPoint files. I mean, we're talking hundreds of slides. And he'd say, no, I'm going to do a short one. And I said, okay. And, a short one for Bob, I found out, was like 60 slides, in 15 minutes. And I tell you, what a beautiful human being. And you can tell he is with us and his spirit's with us, because just look at all the smiles on people's faces. And if there are tears, they're tears of joy, pure joy, just thinking of Bob Gough. So I've got this great facilitate a discussion, and we're just going to open it up and let people share their thoughts and remembrances about Bob. Of course, we could talk about a whole range of things. We could talk about, Intertribal Council on Utility Policy. We could talk about the way Pat Spears and Bob Gough worked with Nancy Maynard to create the first Native Peoples Native Homelands workshop on climate change in 1998. We could talk about, all kinds of activities, how he worked with, some friends of the Climate Institute and people like Mike McCracken and other people with John Topic, trying to really tackle the big issues of how do we upgrade the current grid system in the United States. So it was like Lisa said, there wasn't a problem too small, nor one too large. If you asked Bob for help, he'd never say no. He might say, well, let me get back with you, or give me a couple of years, let me think on it. But he would always get back with you. And that was Bob. So I'm not going to take up a lot of time right now. I do want to introduce our panelist. And I don't know now, is Alex, are we going to use a video from her at this point? Okay, let me introduce our first speaker, who's recorded a video for us, because she's successfully, I know, defending her master's thesis right now. And the reason I know she's doing it successfully is because she is a Haskell alum, Haskell Indian Nations University. And so Alex Kimball Williams, multicultural artist, community organizer, songwriter, scientist, just an incredibly talented, gifted young woman, has made a recording to share with us today. So, Julie, I guess you're going to cue that up for us.
Hi, I'm Alice Kimball Williams. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm Aleut Alaskan Native, Black, and Portuguese for the most part. I got my undergrad in environmental science from Haskell Indian Nations in 2015, and hopefully, as I'm speaking, I am successfully defending for my master's in Indigenous Studies at KU. I also have a really good background, a really rich background in community organizing and social justice work, and I work as the health equity planner currently at the local health department. I bring a lot of these things to my work academically and professionally. I had the honor of meeting and knowing Bob through Dr. Wildcat, and I appreciate every moment I've been able to spend with knowledge holders like him. I'm incredibly grateful also for his contributions to our field. I'm also honored to have your attention today, and I look forward to seeing the recording later so I can see what other people had to say. Julie asked if I'd speak as an extension of discussions and emails that we had earlier this year about anti-racism within climate justice work, specifically to examine the intersections of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty and the less discussed social interplay between these socio-political groups. There are obvious connections between Black and Indigenous peoples as relates to environmental racism, health disparities, food deserts, and more. I won't completely recap our discussions in our emails, but I will share pieces of it for the folks that weren't there, and also as a refresher for those that were. And then I'll transition into new material that I'd like to share today. To begin, there are a number of ways that Black and Native multiracial people might overcome past and current hurts caused by one another, and how we might navigate our differences and our parallels in our activism and histories. The biggest hurdle to jump first is understanding and appreciating our differences. Too often in activist circles, I see our differences being cast aside beyond just what our visual identities are. I think that it's really important to appreciate all of the worldview and perceptual differences that Natives and Black folks bring to these circles. The biggest difference socially between the groups, for example, is that Native folks belong to the smallest racial minority. And for a long time anyway, we were recently outnumbered by our Latinx relatives. For a long time, Black folks were the largest racial minority. These contextual differences create a dynamic where Native folks typically have very little national relevance and influence, which leads to fewer opportunities to build and leverage solidarity with Black folks. Solidarity is about sharing or agreeing to share influence, power, and risks. And so naturally, if you have less of that, it's a little more difficult to navigate these situations of solidarity. Many Native folks think that, one, we have nothing to offer, and two, we shouldn't be asked to offer anything because we have so little to offer, because our own issues are so great and we receive less attention in comparison oftentimes to other racial minorities. The other elephant in the room in these conversations is the social, cultural, racial, political, etc. differences between these identities and how that has changed specifically over time. Many Black folks see themselves as a racial minority, with a shared ancestry and usually an amorphous kind of shared culture, while Native folks often see themselves, more often anyway, as political minorities with unique ancestries and cultures. When navigating conversations of race and climate justice between the groups, it's always helpful to understand these dynamics. There are many ways that environmental racism, ecofeminism, and more relate similarly within both groups. For example, both groups shared a spike in national attention and influence in the 1960s, as well in recent years, so 2014 onwards. And each of these time periods are definitely tied to environmental issues as well as anti-capitalist and anti-war struggles. Both groups experience specific health disparities, wealth inequities, and more throughout history, usually at the same times. There's a lot of really interesting interplay in terms of histories there. But I think the most interesting thing to me in terms of the 1960s anyway, the shared histories, was that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated just 1 month after he was publicly coordinating with leaders of the American Indian movement, specifically because our intersectional efforts to connect have been purposely torn down. The instinct to rebel against that can definitely be seen among young activists who have grown up in a somewhat different world, with lessons learned from over-surveillance and our prevailing relatives. I have the utmost respect for everyone who laid the groundwork so that we can work together today. One of the developments that I see today, which I know has roots in the previous and ongoing generations, is the distinction of the word protector within Native advocacy. This frames the responsibility that we have towards the planet and our relatives so perfectly. We have taken this frame of mind into environmental and Native activism, and we're called to bring this part of our worldviews into COVID-19 and the current social moment. What we've learned in practice as protectors has a place in how the world responds to the growing climate change crisis, as well as COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, our disruption of economies and governments in Black and brown countries across the world, and so much more. It's not only about how we are advocating, but how we are encouraging others to understand another way of knowing and moving. What makes Native activism so special is it's always about more than whatever we're directly advocating for. It's always about more than humanity. And that's what we have to offer these realms of intersectionality and solidarity with Black and African communities. And today within COVID-19 and the 2020 isms, as I've been calling them, though the roots of what's happening obviously predate this year, of course. Related to the self-perception of ourselves as protectors and stewards is the concept of land back and what that actually means. I mean, besides the literal, obviously, like giving the land back, but, beyond that and how exactly it must be tied to climate change, the way everything kind of is. I saw last week a First Nations community leader, Nikita Longman, share something very interesting. They said, anytime an Indigenous person or nation has pushed back against the oppressive state, they are exercising some form of land back. So beyond the literal return of land to Indigenous stewardship, or even stretching land back to refer to sustainable environmental policies in general, land back is about challenging racism, Western and white supremacy, capitalism, and the fake democracy we're under. With this broader definition, we're tying in urban natives too, who may not have a literal desire for the land itself, but would definitely appreciate affordable or sustainable housing, urban sovereignty, and all of that. Land back literally throws to the side the fluff words of English. It doesn't even attempt to be a sentence, and it also doesn't ask. It's not asking for anything necessarily, but it almost does ask for acknowledgement not only of us and what has happened to our tribes, but also what has happened to the land and our relatives as a result. It's calling attention to the inadequacy and the destruction of something which we all need. We all need the planet beyond what white supremacy can understand. It's a critique of whiteness and colonialism, and in a way, it's done in a way that previous conversations around self-determination and indigenous sovereignty haven't exactly ventured, at least not in the same way. So I've been thinking about how the concepts of land back and Black Lives Matter have operated and how we have handled them perhaps incorrectly in a mutually exclusive way. Land back negates Black membership, of course, because this is not our land. Even the land-based reparations that we were promised, don't really work, and they didn't even happen. And then, of course, the phrase Black Lives Matter doesn't directly implicate Native groups, though one could interpret overlap. I think it's the responsibility of Black and Native people, though, to see how these concepts blend and relate to the issues at hand, how our movements might feed into one another. Already, there are actions and statements tribes and Native organizations have made with solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and the mission of Black Lives Matter includes Indigenous struggle and anti-capitalism. I'm excited to see how this continues to develop as I stand with 2 feet in 2 different spaces all too often. There are many reasons for Black and Native solidarity as we engage with the 2020isms and the ongoing climate change. Least of all would be my own personal convenience, but I am putting that out there. It would make my life a lot easier the more that we did things together. I hope that I've inspired you to continue thinking about these issues, and I hope your families are doing well as possible during this time. I know for a fact that, I'm speaking to a room where people have lost their loved ones to a preventable disease that has been mismanaged by the same system that needs to give the land back and acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. Kahalakuk, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, you can see why we are so proud of, young scholars and activists and just beautiful human beings like Alex. She's really, I think, emblematic of and representative of what we have in our tribal colleges and universities in the United States. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce another just incredibly bright, talented tribal college student. Jasmine Neosh. She's a student at the College of Menominee Nation and works with the climate change and tribes research as a climate change and tribes research assistant at the Sustainability Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation. So it's really great to have Jasmine here and her reflections that she'd like to share with us today. So, Jasmine, the floor is yours.
Mashuanan, thank you so much, Dr. Wildcat, and thank you all for having me here. Really honored to be here with you all today. I should say that Bob passed the year before I became involved with Rising Voices. And although I didn't get to meet him personally, his influence on the space has been indelible and very keenly felt, even by those of us who didn't get to participate in it directly, which is not something I think that you can say about everybody. I think that's something that we all aspire to, and very, very few people in this world attain. It's especially exciting to be here with you all at a time when I feel like these gatherings are more important than ever. We live in a time where we're constantly bombarded by information of varying degrees of relevance and validity. And at times like that, Rising Voices reminds me of the importance of stories, of making sure that we humanize these really big concepts that we all grapple with on a day-to-day basis, especially in fields where that sort of thing isn't always prized right at the forefront, right? Where that's something that sometimes we have to fight for a little bit. It's especially important right now because I think a lot of things are changing, right? This is right now a very scary time for a lot of people. But I think this is also a time that should be really exciting for all of us. The things that are scary about this are also a sign that really big things are coming. We're at a point right now where some of the work that's been done by the other people on this panel, I think that's starting to really pay off. Things are moving forward, very painfully at times, but they are moving forward. We're at a point now where, for example, if there's some discussion on some major news network somewhere, and it's all a bunch of, upper class, cis het white guys, we're not the only ones who are going to step up and say, hey, what the hell? Like, why is this such a homogenous panel? Where are these other voices coming from? And I think that's a really great sign that allyship is changing into something that's a little bit more meaningful to all of us. But of course, there's a lot more work to do. Along with the fact that things are changing, means that the time for excuses for them not to move forward is coming to a very abrupt end. It's no longer valid to be able to say to our folks of other marginalized identities, our trans relatives, hey, he's from a different time. It's no longer acceptable to look at a program where there are no people of color and say, well, these are the only people that we can find. And unfortunately, what that means is that we're in a place right now where we have to have some really difficult conversations. Oftentimes with people who are very dear to us, and oftentimes with people we really don't want to have those conversations with. The problem is that not doing that has some very meaningful consequences for what we do. Racial injustice, gender injustice, marginalization of all these other identities, that isn't just something that happens out there in the streets, right? A lot of times I think in the spaces that we're in, we have a tendency to think of what's going on out there, what's going on in here as two very separate things, but they're not. All the things that you see happening out there, they're happening in our fields too. They're happening in our programs, they're happening in our universities, they're happening in our labs. And I think the great thing about this year has been, in addition to finding my own voice, which Rising Voices has been huge in, this has been a time of tremendous listening for me. And one of the things that I've learned is that, Indigenous people are not the only people in the United States who have a relationship and a knowledge of the land that is made up of oral tradition. We are not the only people who have ancestors and blood and bodies in the ground, and who feel that influence today. And just like the world of climate science is less informed by an absence of our stories, there is also a systemic absence of those voices that is leaving a hole in our fields as well, specifically the work of our Black scientists who are, facing some of the things that Alex so eloquently put out there. I've been absolutely appalled at the stories I've heard from folks whose entrance into environmental science and fieldwork is limited by the fact that they can't go anywhere without a reasonable worry that some jogger will call the cops on them. I can't even imagine trying to do my work under those circumstances and competing with people for whom that's not a reasonable daily concern. And obviously we have our own issues, right? Indigenous people are not so well off that we can run around saving the rest of the planet from itself. But aside from the fact that we should care about people just intrinsically, because that's the people that we are meant to be, the people that we're raised to be, aside from the fact that our stories are intertwined historically, we should also realize that with problems as big as climate change, if we're not attacking this problem with as many of our knowledges as we can, as many voices and ways of understanding, and as many brilliant people as we can, we're not really giving this effort, this huge problem, the effort that it deserves. So that's one of the things that I definitely wanted to, kind of bring into this space as we're going forward, as we're making this incredible progress. Let's also remember that we're not the only folks who are going through these things, and that we are so much stronger when we combine those together, when we speak with each other, listen to each other, and really make an effort to bring other people along with us, bring other people to the table and pull up another chair. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I can tell by your thoughts and the ideas you shared that yes, Bob Gough has definitely influenced your thinking and the way you approach issues. One of the things that was beautiful about Bob was I never really saw Bob back away from a difficult discussion. He was always the one to find a way to start that discussion, to move ideas forward. And sometimes, like at Native Peoples, Native Homelands, the second one we convened back in 2009, and we're working on a statement, a statement of principles, a declaration, or something we could issue. And he was one of the people who, sat at the table for hours while everyone was wordsmithing a document. And again, trying to make sure we captured, the core of what was important. And it's all about justice, that's for sure. So thank you for sharing, Jasmine. I think that, got a great opportunity to hear from another young Indigenous woman, Melissa Watkinson. She is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and also a descendant of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And she grew up in Washington State, where some of her family are members of the Upper Skagit tribe. Melissa considers the Salish Sea her home, where she works as the Equity, Access, and Community Engagement Lead with the Washington Sea Grant to ensure equitable and inclusive access to the marine environment and workforce. So really glad to have Melissa join us. So Melissa, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Dan. It's so good to be in this space, and I feel really honored to have been invited to speak at this symposium in honor of Bob. My name is Melissa Watkinson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and descend from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I currently live in the traditional homelands of the Suquamish tribe and Duwamish peoples here in Bremerton, Washington. I recently entered a new role at Washington Sea Grant. I've been there for 3 years now. Washington Sea Grant is a program that works with coastal communities and environments to make sure that we have healthy ecosystems and communities that thrive. Of course, that's kind of always been reflective of the dominant culture of who is in the marine science and policy fields and working at Washington Sea Grant, which hasn't always been diverse. And so, as you can imagine, there are many communities who haven't been reflected in the work that's been done within the organization. So my new role as the Equity, Access, and Community Engagement Lead will hopefully support our organization and the broader marine field to do some of that work, which heavily in Washington State heavily includes coastal tribes and Indigenous communities. So I wanted to briefly reflect on my experiences with knowing Bob. I first met Bob at the Shifting Seasons Symposium at the College of Menominee Nation in 2014. Let's see, I was taking notes, and I remember that's when I first met Kyle and Julie and some others who are on this call. Boy, did that really change my life, really. But I remember Julie kind of reflecting and inviting me to participate in Rising Voices, because they had talked about Rising Voices as a program at the time. And I remember Bob responding with something along the lines of, "You don't have a choice to join us, you're already part of us." And I feel like without skipping a beat, Bob had already made me feel like I was part of the Rising Voices family and made me really feel like I belong here. So in response to some of the things that were prompted for our talk, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what does it mean to belong? The question was kind of about inclusivity and diversity and Indigenous knowledges. And for me, when I think about, equity, access, inclusion, diversity, justice, belonging is kind of at the center of all of that. And just kind of as a subheader, belonging is something that you as an individual get to decide whether or not you belong in a space, but it's the job and responsibility of everybody in that space to make it to create that culture of belonging. So nobody gets to decide for you whether or not you belong in a space, but they do have a lot of power in creating a space where you can feel that way. So much like most fields that are studied heavily in the academic realm, climate-related work has a dominant culture which centers whiteness and makes those who are most affected, which are predominantly communities of color, as the other. There are, of course, exceptions to this within tribes who practice their sovereignty and community-based organizations who have the capacity and resources to address climate change within their own communities. I hope you can realize this is a call to approach climate change work through belonging. However, and this is what I believe to be the objective for Rising Voices, as my experience has been, in order to address the cumulative effects of our current disasters, we must create spaces where everyone belongs. The risks and consequences of not doing so will lead to dominant white academic cultures conducting science that does not reflect the values and impacts of communities' experiences, and the capacity and resources to incorporate the knowledge systems that would otherwise advance the mitigation and adaptation efforts, and which won't be distributed equitably to those who have the strongest capabilities of addressing those disasters, tribes, indigenous communities, and communities of color. So we might all have our own experiences or ideas of what it means to create a space of belonging. I've got some ideas I can share, and from what I can say is one thing I recently learned from a diversity scholar, Aiko Bethea, is this term called centering white timing, and it had such a, I guess, I had a physical reaction to it because it just reflected so much of how I felt, what has happened over this past 6 months in response to the murder of George Floyd and the more recent uprising of social justice work, and being in positions where a lot of indigenous folks and people of color who are in predominantly white spaces are often already the ones leading the work for creating a space of belonging. Yet when the dominant culture decides that it's something that's worthwhile working on, then they kind of derail the progress that's been having, and then there's a spike and then there's a drop. And so this, for me, and I experienced this heavily as in my own work and in centering white timing. And I guess a call is just to can we just center indigenous timing? Can that be something that we do in all of our spaces? So how do we create a space of belonging? I think in acknowledging what actually you bring to the table as an indigenous or non-indigenous person, what knowledge system and what knowledge do your contributions reflect? Hire and pay equitably indigenous peoples into your program, and not just one, but two or multiple, because indigenous folks in predominantly non-indigenous spaces should not across different cultures that are not a part of the dominant culture. Provide intentional time for relationship building, and that's particularly difficult in this experience where we can't sit across the table and share food. I don't get to drink that bottle of whiskey with Kalani, but how do we pivot that to the Zoom world, right? maybe that means in your agendas you spend more time for those check-ins and awkward silences than you typically would, so that we can each have a space where everyone can contribute and really connect with one another. And then, there's lots of different ways we can respond, and I'm curious if other people have ideas, but really ask yourselves, who does our work reflect and who is our work for? We must be able to answer those questions, and hopefully the response to those questions, can reflect one another. And thanks again for having me here, and excited to see everyone that's part of here. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for sharing. It's easy to see how these relations, that we're all a part of, we are all related, get manifested through institutions. And so far, everyone has mentioned, a tribal college or meeting someone at a tribal college. And I think that would really is something that's putting a smile right now on Brother Bob's face, because he was one of those persons who was really an advocate for us strengthening our tribal colleges and universities. So it's really great. And of course, Rising Voices has been very much a part of that also. So I've got the honor of introducing again another tribal college and university superstar. And again, I am more than glad to say an alumnus of Haskell Indian Nations University, and that's Paulette Blanchard. And anyone who's been around Rising Voices or interested in climate change and its impacts on Indigenous people in the last 10 years probably don't need to say a lot about Paulette, but she's finishing her PhD. She's a enrolled member, absentee Shanti. I believe she has some Kickapoo heritage too. But Paulette is really, to me, the embodiment of this next generation of scholars. You young women who have spoken represent. I mean, we're really talking about that next generation and the issues that you're facing and addressing the intersectionality that we have to be cognizant of in the institutions and all these complicated relationships that we move through. Paulette is really at the center of doing that work, and really doing so through addressing climate change and its impacts on Indigenous people. So with no further ado, Paulette, the floor is yours.
Well, instead of the floor, I'm going to swap for the sharing of the screen, because I spent a lot of time today trying to find like my first picture of Bob Gough. Because Bob used to make fun of me for how many pictures I took and posted all the time. And so I'm going to start with one that I found. And the only, there's a lot of people that are missing in this image, but to me, this is Bob. Bob was always surrounded by the coolest people and walked among giants, as he was one as well. And the first time I met Bob was at the Rights of Mother Earth conference at Haskell. And I looked so hard for that picture, and I'm sure it's somewhere, but Bob was everywhere. Here we have Oren Lyons and Dan Wildcat. We were, at Dartmouth, and Bob seemed to be everywhere something magical or cool was happening, surrounded by the best and the most bright Native men and women, young, up and coming, and the elders were there was always this balance of the youth and the elders, and this incredible diversity and just absolute fun. Bob always had a story, a joke. He was known as the most interesting man in the world all the time, and he always inspired. Like Lyman still talks to me about the impact and influence that Bob and other mentors like him had on all of us. And this is especially true for me because Bob nurtured me through my own traumas with grad school and with navigating the stresses of trying to be in that in-between world of academia, tribal community, and science, because it can be a very harsh place, but he taught me and many others how to just roll with the flow, how to be personable, how to be authentic, how to be on your A game, even if, you were having a B day or C day. And there was never a stranger. He greeted you with a hug. He shared breath. He was family. And he never treated you less than that. And so every time I had an opportunity, I would sneak, and just sit close enough to hear what him and my other mentors were visiting about so that I might learn something. And I just hoped that osmosis was a real thing, because I sure was trying very hard to absorb the knowledge of the people that Bob seemed to be surrounded by all the time. And through that, I have made the most incredible relationships with people I call relatives now. And I would not be where I am had I not had these amazing mentors and friends who have now become family to guide me through these moments of sometimes violence, sometimes tears, sometimes friendships breaking up, and then always new ones growing. And Bob used to crack me up because I would observe and pay close attention to where he was, what he was doing, who he was talking to, if I needed, to sneak up and stand close so I could hear. But if that happened and he saw me, he'd introduce me and he'd somehow put me on the spot. And then like Homer Simpson, he'd fade into the shrubbery and be gone. And I'd be left standing there having to, talk about something that maybe I did or didn't know a lot about. But he made sure that we were always included in whatever was happening. And sacred moments all the time with just love and friendship and laughter and heart and everything he did. And he always made sure that, whoever was in his family, in his ohana, in his arm's reach would be included in the work. And he and Kalani put me on a spot, and balanced the Rising Voices leadership, from the Indigenous part. And it was hard and scary, but Dan did the same thing to me too early on. But those opportunities allowed me to go to places I never would have dreamed and I didn't know exist, to meet people that I still work with and pray to continue to have long-term friendships with. And I have been so blessed to call Bob my friend, my Uncle Bob, and my partner in crime sometimes, because we would have our silliness. I mean, like one time we were all at a bar at OU after the working group, and it happened to be trivia night. And Bull, Dan, Bob, I mean, a bunch of us were sitting there, and we hadn't signed up for the trivia, but by God, we were answering all the questions and just making everybody else in the bar mad. Because we hadn't signed up for the thing, and it was just hilarious. And so this I want to share, wrapping this up. This is very special to me because this is my last opportunity to spend time with Bob. And even in the center of chaos, Bob would try to always resolve a problem, because at this time, Bull and I's friendship had kind of went a different way. And Kalani and Bob and I, we were all talking about having a type of a healing ceremony to bring Bull back into the friendship of the group and try to make things right. And because we're always better, we're always stronger with more than less, with more of us, and everybody had a part. And here's my daughter and my partner Mark, and all of us, just chilling out, drinking, eating, sharing stories. And, later that night, Bob was watching cat videos with a cat on the couch. And he and the cat were both watching him at the same time on his computer. So it was moments like that, I will always treasure, because Bob was a leader. He was a friend. He was so many things, but most of all, he truly was my friend, and somebody I could look up to and knew cared about me and I could trust. And I'm I do miss Bob. I miss Bob a lot. So thank you for the opportunity to share, because Bob helped me grow as a human being and as a human doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paulette. That is so beautiful. There's certain qualities. There are certain people you meet in your life, who their wisdom, doesn't devolve from letters after their names, EDD or PhD or whatever, MD, but it comes from a wisdom, really born of experience. And I think those of us that were able to spend time with Bob knew that you wanted to pay attention. When you were hanging out with Bob, you were going to get great stories, you were going to laugh, but most importantly, you were going to be reminded about something about what it meant to be a real human being, a mature human being, a competent human being. And boy, I tell you what, we could sure use a lot more of those mature, competent human beings on this planet right now. And Bob that's Bob. So batting cleanup today for us is no less than Kyle Palace White. He has recently moved from Michigan State to the University of Michigan, where he is the professor of environment and sustainability, and George Willis Pack professor at the University of Michigan. And he's a Citizens Band Potawatomi, and has done a lot of good work with tribal colleges, up in his neck of the woods, up in the Great Lakes areas. And I know has worked with students who benefited greatly from being able to work with Kyle and be mentored by him. So, Kyle, you're gonna do cleanup on this panel for us, okay? The floor is yours.
Okay, I appreciate it, Dan, and thanks to Hank and Kalani for the special introduction, to Heather and Julie for their words, and for Mariah and all of the family and the team. I appreciate what everybody has shared, and it's a happy and a challenging moment right now as we make these reflections. I know an important part of this symposium is our discussion, and I wanted to express something fairly powerful that I've been thinking of in listening to what everybody has shared. So Lisa mentioned, and I'm really grateful for what Lisa shared, that Bob never said no.
Right.
Yeah, and you know why? Because Bob was all about relationships. Bob's entire life was held up by relationships. I can't say the same for myself. There's instrumental relationships with my job and so on that, unfortunately, right, play a role, in sustaining me. And I think a lot of us, we aspire to be where Bob was at in terms of living solely by relationship, solely by kinship. And what I think is powerful about that, right, is the idea that Bob never said no, because Bob sustained himself by relationships because he sustained relationships. He sustained relationships with others, for others. And for Bob, if you were to peel back all the layers, you'd find more and more relationships, right? You wouldn't find something else there at the foundation. You'd find relationships. Bob didn't tell time with a clock. He lived through the relationships. The reason why Bob's timing was amazing was because the relationships were moving him in those directions to be at the right place in the right time. And, that's why Bob knew so much about what was going on. He didn't find out because he looked up environmental justice or climate justice in Google, right? It was the relationships that sustained him. And so I think for me, just reflecting on this is really in some ways, it's a challenge, right? When we say that we're about kinship and relationships, how much is that true? Do we really sustain ourselves like many of our ancestors did by relationships? By big R relationships, kinship relationships, responsibilities, right? If you peeled back the layers again with Bob, you'd find responsibility after responsibility. And so how many of us really, really lived the way that Bob did? And so I just want us to think about that and, the importance of what Bob exemplified and modeled. And we see the impacts in what everybody shared. And that's the power of the network of responsibilities of relationships. I look forward to our discussion coming up, but miigwech, and thanks for the time to share.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. And I think that's really a great segue to go into discussion. And I don't know if someone's managing this, or is someone going to sort of, I guess if people raise their hands, and I know I haven't been looking at the chat box, but I'm sure that people have stories to share. They have something that they're thinking about as a result of this, and this really is a celebration. It's a celebration of this spirit that, Bob's not here in bodily form with us anymore, but it's like if anyone who's been engaged with Rising Voices or, was involved with some of our early American Indian Alaska Native Climate Change Working Group meetings, or later the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group meetings, Bob he's always a presence, and he was always that presence that brought a positive sort of energy into a space, a beauty really into a space. And I think this would be a great time for just people to share stories, thoughts, memories, or maybe something that this celebration today has made you think more deeply about. So the floor is open, and I'm really. I don't know if Julie, you can unmute people or how that works, or.
Well, I would like to jump in real quick, and because I was Bob always had the craziest things happen to him, and he handled it with the ultimate light heart. One of my favorite experiences was at Duncan and Edna's house in Boulder, and this was the last time we were all together at their house, and somebody had left and walked out in Bob's shoes. And left their shoes, which they looked similar. They were both black and kind of tennis shoes. And so somehow we figured out who was the only other person that could have possibly walked out with them. And they they tracked him down. And Bob calls him and he goes, "I think you have my shoes." And he goes, No, I have my shoes on. He goes, "No, I think you have my shoes on." He goes, he looks down and Bob's like, "Yeah, they're this kind of shoe." And the guy's like, "Well, no, mine are this kinds of shoe." And he goes, "Yeah, I know. I'm looking at them." He goes, the other guy says, "Well, these are pretty comfortable." And Bob just starts laughing. He goes, "Those are my shoes. I, kind of need them. Yours are a little big on me." And he just kind of breezed through it. And I was in tears because he was just making little witty instant comments and trying to be kind to the elderly gentleman that was wearing his shoes literally. And if anybody, I see Julie, she remembers the story. If anybody else wants to share it, that kind of thing, because Bob was the ultimate politician, never had a bad day, always just had a solution to a problem instead of a problem. So thank you for giving me that moment, because Bob was notorious for those kinds of moments.
That's a great story. That's a fantastic story. Yes, yes. So the floor is open. Comments, stories, other great Bob stories.
Well, I will share. I was going to wait till I talk in a minute, but so the last I'm going to say some thank yous in just a bit. So, but just to acknowledge everyone that has shared so far today, just huge appreciation. And the last time that I saw Bob physically in person was about 3 or 4 weeks before he passed on. He came out here and was visiting with us for a little while. And it was about close to midnight, and we were over on the campus here. And my last kind of glimpse at him, he was kind of sitting up against this building, just kind of gazing out at the ocean. And, and he was insistent he had a ride to the airport that was like a couple miles away, and it's almost midnight. And I was like, Bob, planes don't fly out of here after like 11 o'clock. Like, are you sure that, one, are you sure you have a ride to the airport? And two, are you sure your flight's leaving tonight? Like, oh yeah, no, that's a good point. No, I'm good. I'm good. I'm going to chill. And, I got home, and of course, he texted me, I don't know, like 10 minutes later. It's like, oh, wait, I leave tomorrow, but this really nice guy he drove by and he got me to my hotel. So I'm going to stay here for the night, and I'll get on. But it was just the perfect, it just flowed, right? And Bob just kind of flowed, and wherever he was, and, you knew you could walk away from him at midnight in the middle of a dark place that he didn't know anyone, and he would somehow meet someone to give him a ride to a hotel and get him on an airplane the next day. There's not too many people I know with that kind of fluidity and radiating of bringing people to them, I think.
Yes.
He radiated something that brought people to them. And, our joke was always you'd have to go to the farthest recesses of the most remote part of Antarctica, and you would still find someone that you were connected to.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 3 degrees of Bob Gough.
Something like that, for sure. Definitely. Bob was, what would you call it? A polymath. He was constantly studying something, and he was, whether it was technical knowledge, whether it was, something about the grid, something about straw bale construction, something about governance, how we could govern ourselves more indigenously and look to those traditions. And I remember, Bob coming to Haskell, and I invited Bob to come and do a presentation. And really, I said, you can talk about really what you think is most important, for us as we think about climate change. It was one of our, at that point, it was an early American Indian Alaska Native climate change meeting. And again, he came in a day early. We went to dinner and everything. And so, I knew he would have a slide presentation. I'm telling you, this guy had more slides than anyone I've ever met. You guys know I have an aversion to PowerPoint, but Bob had PowerPoints, man, I'm telling you. And so I said, okay, Bob, what are you going to talk about? And he says, well, I think, I want to talk about, what we can do, in Indian country to really play a leadership role in this. And I always remember this, and I'm not sure I've got the exact terminology correct, but I'm thinking about this now in terms of what we've seen happen in the most recent presidential election, the narrow margin of victory for Joe Biden. I think it was one of my students at the end, sort of raised this question, well, I really liked your presentation, and Bob was always emphasizing our voices need to be heard. We need to be engaged. And one of my students asking this question, but we're only like 1%, 1 plus maybe not quite 2% of the general U.S. population. How are we going to have an impact? And some of you will remember this. He used to talk about this often. He said, you've got to remember, we're never going to be the majority, he says, but we could be that crucial swing vote that changes the entire political landscape. And to me, that's the embodiment of Bob Gough's worldview. It was always seeing that, hey, doing good work is intrinsically valuable, and we may be small in number, but you know what? If we really get our act together, we might really be that swing vote that could really change the trajectory of where we're at on the planet. I think about that a lot because I do believe Indigenous people right now are that swing vote, that we can really help change the trajectory, with some of the wisdom that we've garnered, and we've learned it from so many people, so many relatives, and just what a great celebration today. Again, I just want to say thanks to Kalani and Hank for getting us started in such a good way, and Heather's comments and Lisa's comments. I mean, I think it was Kalani who said it at our first Rising Voices meeting. Hey, when we get together, we gather as family, and that has an advantage. It has an advantage because when you're with family, you're expected to be honest, not always right. As my good crazy uncle Merv Tano, and I say that lovingly, my Hawaiian uncle Merv says, I made a comment at a meeting, a climate change meeting, and I said, I'm going to speak honestly, and I want people to understand. I know that means I might not be right, but it'll be honest. And he goes like, Dan, you are one of those people who is honestly wrong a lot of the time. And I thought, that's family. That's what you have to have. Are you in a safe space where it's all right to be honestly wrong? And because you're going to have an auntie or an uncle who's going to say, Dan, let's talk about this, because I think maybe there's another way of looking at this. To me, that's the kind of energy Bob Gough brought to a place. And I'm the richer for it. And I know most of you feel like you are too. So, oh my gosh, what a great, a wonderful celebration. Okay, I'll shut up. I saw someone click on, they wanted to say something. Who's got the 808 number?
Yes, Ben.
Okay.
Ben, this is Bill.
Bill, great.
Hey, Ben, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, these are great stories. I mean, we always call Bob Brother Bob, right? And, we've all gotten into these situations where we're actually conspiring to do good things or to make good trouble. And Bob was certainly front and center of all of those. But we're talking about relationships, and I just want to give you this really short story. And our neighbors, we've been with been living in this place for 30 years now. I was talking to our neighbors a few years ago, and one is the Deputy Attorney General here, and the other is his wife is a lawyer downtown, and they're both Colorado University graduates at the law school. And we're chatting, and, what do you do, blah, 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 who do you work with? And I mentioned Bob's name. And John Itamura just stops me and goes, wait, Bob Gough, the crazy horse guy? I said, yeah. He goes, he's really famous. How do you know Bob Gough? I said, that's amazing. And I meet him someday. I said, sure, if he comes by. I told Bob about this. He sort of laughed at this statement. I think maybe more infamous. And he took everything with a grain of salt, never took himself that seriously. Now, I have a library of Bobisms, and they talk about his sense of humor. So he was there all the time, about his connectedness. Before he passed away, you remember on the Big Island for that primo meeting on our EK Hui, just a couple of weeks before he passed away. But he and I were talking about a company in Iceland that was making rebar, shingles, and siding out of basalt, which is impervious to everything. They're looking for markets. I've never heard of that. Yet Bob, as Kyle and everybody else, Dan, you, and Paul have said that he knew a lot about everything. This was not a man that was shallow. That was spread wide, but really shallow in his knowledge. He was deep and deep, but never took himself that seriously. And the pictures I got from Bob, I don't know one where he's not smiling or making a face or making a gesture that was all in humor. Regardless of what people thought of Bob as far as his stature, being the most interesting man in the world, which he laughed at, and he actually owned up to it in really funny ways. But Paulette, you hit the nail on the head where you said, you miss Bob. I miss him every day. I know Kalani does. I know Dan does. I know all of us in the family do that. Bob has had such an impact on our lives. And with Dan and Dan, Heather and I were driving up to Bob's funeral in Rosebud. And on the 7 hours from Denver, on the 7 hours up and the 7 hours back, we came up with all these great ideas for publications, for what we want to do with Rising Voices. Because both Heather and Dan, as well as that, we could feel Bob in the car, this rental car that we were driving. So Bob is not only the most interesting man in the world, he's the most interesting, influential person in the universe.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
So when you look at the impact, other than the universal one, look on a map, look for Oahu, look on the east side, look for Haiku Valley. That's where I live, and that's where John Itamura lives. And he's had an impact even over here.
Yeah.
With my neighbor.
Great story. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me share that.
You bet. Thank you. Well, I think I hate to close this down, but I know we're scheduled for an hour and a half, so I'll stop and I don't know, what's the next move? Are we going to go back for a closing?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dan, and we'll hand over to Hank and Kalani in just a sec. We just we really want to, while this was Bob's Symposium, it's also kind of the culminating of the Virtual Rising Voices 8 series and kind of programming for the Bonkers 2020, and just wanted to take a moment just to really thank the Rising Voices Council and the steering committee for all of your continued leadership and guidance, to UCAR's Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and NOAA's Office for Coastal Management for providing funding to the program, to Lomakai Media and Olahana Foundation and that whole family for just your epically visionary leadership in making this even possible. There's a world of gratitude, and just all the speakers today, to Melissa, to Jasmine, Paulette, Kyle, Alex, to Lisa for sharing your dad with us, to Dan for continuing to be, our guide in so many ways, to Bill for your words and wisdom, to all the speakers and facilitators throughout the Virtual Rising Voices series the last few months. to Malu for who's been supporting a lot of the evaluation for this and helping us learn new ways to do better, to Uncle Hank for your spiritual guidance and your shared wisdom. We really want to acknowledge Chris Marwitz, who also, walked on this year, and her years dedicated to and her passion and absolute love for the RV family. And, often it's the folks behind the scenes that really make everything function and thrive, and very much feel Chris with us here. And one of Bob's best attributes was, even though he drove her crazy, like, can you imagine trying to organize Bob's travel? She still loved him absolutely dearly, and they had a beautiful relationship, and that was a lot of the magic. And to Bob, of course, for continuing to pull us up and to pull us together. And of course, while we desperately miss being physically together, we are so deeply grateful to all those who made it possible to connect in alternate ways these past months. And, these have been challenging, different times, to say the least, but we really remain ever grateful to our Rising Voices family, who continues to lift each other up, fills this world with so much love and gratitude, and keeps on really with the good work, as Bob would have it. So we just want everyone, please stay safe and healthy, take care of yourselves and each other. And we really look forward to continuing to find creative ways to come together in the new year upon us. So Kalani and Hank, over to you. And thank you hugely to everybody for coming together today and honoring our dear mentor, Bob.
Bob and Pat Spears used to say it's easier to pull the rope than it is to push it. So, we got folks over there on the other side pulling the rope. Couple quick stories about Bob. Dan can attest to this. I first met him in Kansas City. I was the last guy to the meeting coming out of Honolulu. We're running late, and I come crossing a snowy field. The hell's a Hawaiian doing in KC? I come to this meeting we're all having with IPCC, WG, and the NOAA climate guys. And the only other empty seat in the room is a chair right next to mine. And apparently Bob Gough is the only guy later than the guy from Hawaii. So Dan literally stops the meeting and says, "This is a momentous occasion. Bob Gough is meeting Kalani Souza." And literally, the two of us have been hanging out from that day since. So I miss him every day dearly. I miss his relationship focus. I miss his ability to build bridges between people. When I first met Paulette out at Haskell, I think I was out there for an Indigenous Environmental Network forum.
Rights of Mother Earth. Rights of Mother Earth.
Thank you. And Paulette was assigned to make sure I kept my nose to the grindstone, didn't get drunk downtown Lawrence and not make it back for the conference. So, short story, I took umbrage at something that happened in the opening session and literally walked out, grabbed my guitar and walked out, and couldn't see my way back into what I now know was my own personal opinion about way things are being managed. A couple years later, I'm over in California at the Pioneers Conference, and Bob grabs me. We run into each other on day one, and he grabs me. He says, "You're coming with me." And he sticks me in a car, and we drive like maybe about 35 minutes down the road to this old steakhouse in Marin County. And I go into the steakhouse, and sitting there on the table is Tom Goldtooth, right? And I hadn't seen him in a couple of years, right? And we're kind of all still miffed at each other. And Bob says, "Sit down." And Tom says, "What kind of steak you ordering?" And that's like the first thing out of his mouth, right? And I'm like, "What's up with that?" And Bob says, "What kind of steak you ordering?" I said, "I don't know, the New York, I guess." And not having a chance to see the menu. And Bob says, "I'll have the prime rib." And Tom says, "Okay, good." And Bob looks at me and he says, "That's the closest you're going to get in an apology from a Lakota. He just bought you a piece of meat. Right? So I had to learn about the culture there, right? And he was like, and that's all the apology you're getting from Tom, right? I was like, got it. And we been fast friends ever since. Bob said the two of you are doing two important work, not to be talking to each other or moving ahead together. So he was right, as always. And I miss my older brother, Bob. Thank you so much for everyone remembering him and pulling him to heart. He was a decent human being. And here in Hawaii, there are many people who miss him. Give us a blow there, Hank.
Okay.
Ko mako e maku I loko kalani na mahalo pia na aku e. Malu I kana lele kako e ki kulu. E ho'omalu, e ho'omalu, e ho'omalu. E ho'omalu I kana lele kako e ki kai uli. E ho'omalu, e ho'omalu, e ho'omalu. May we all be protected as we move to the far horizon. May we all be protected as we cross the dark ocean. The future, yet unseen, unnavigated. Be well, be safe, keep your families well. One more shot for my dear friend, Bob Gough. Bob, love you, brother. Thank you, Rising Voices, one and all. Miss you guys. Aloha.
Thank you.
Thank you.